I'm a huge fan of the Indiana Jones movie franchise. For me, the pinnacle is reached during the Last Crusade, as our hero Dr. Jones is challenged to choose the correct cup of Christ in order to save his father from bleeding out in front of him. The Nazi sympathizer, Walter Donovan, elects to choose first, accepting a bejeweled glass fit for the King of Kings. He takes a long drink before then unleashing an agonizing scream of pain. His colleagues jump back, reacting in horror as he disintegrates first into a skeletal monstrosity and then into a cloud of dust. It is only then that the ancient Grail Knight informs Indy and the audience that he chose poorly. Author Graham Brown tells us that life is about choices. Some we regret, some we're proud of, some will haunt us forever. The message? We are what we choose to be. These choices have consequences that go on to ripple unpredictably throughout our lives. Napoleon Bonaparte knew that his decisions would fundamentally alter millions of lives, and thus proclaimed that nothing is more difficult and therefore more precious than to be able to decide. Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher responsible for the Pythagorean theory, points out that choices are the hinges of destiny. Actress Angelina Jolie has never shied away from making a big decision. She secretly married co-star Billy Bob Thornton and shocked everyone when she revealed that the couple continuously wore vials of each other's blood. When that relationship failed, she had an affair with Brad Pitt, who was married at the time to Jennifer Aniston. The two captured America's attention, ushering in the hashtag era with Brangelina, before having 3 biological kids together while adopting another trio. By all accounts, it appeared as though their relationship was rock solid, but word came out in 2016 that Jolie was seeking a divorce as well as custody of their 6 children. Although the two were both peak Hollywood players, the couple viciously fought over custody and property, prolonging the messy split for 7 incredible years. It is impossible for an outsider to know what happens within the confines of a relationship, and despite the fact that he appears to be estranged from at least some of his children, Pitt sounded like a typical parent when he claimed in 2011 that "we're hunted. Our kids have to live behind a gate. Outside, there are people with cameras. But I'll take the trade-off. I never knew I was capable of experiencing so much love." He maintained that thought in his speech accepting the 2020 Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, crediting his children for coloring everything that he does. Brad Pitt made a series of choices, beginning first with his decision to separate from Jennifer Aniston, and then to begin a public relationship with Angelina Jolie. When that connection began, the two likely would have imagined that they were finally getting their ideal partner for life's journey. Cleopatra would have imagined the same thing in 48 BCE when she first hooked up with Julius Caesar. Having emerged victorious from 2 separate civil wars, the Roman consul was undoubtedly the most powerful man in Cleopatra's known world. He alone had the power to remove the obstacle that was her brother/husband, heroically intervening on her behalf, risking his life for hers. Despite the 30-year age difference, Julius appears to have been a kindred soul, someone who could relate to her challenges of governing a country. He was also a man who mimicked her vast ambition. After all, he traced his family line back to the goddess Venus, while she closely aligned herself with the reborn deity Isis. Their shared ambition and divine aspirations seemed like a perfect match. However, this seemingly ideal choice would later jeopardize everything for Cleopatra, leaving her in a fight over custody of her son's inheritance, as well as her country. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the rise and fall of Egyptian ruler Cleopatra. Episode number 3, Beware the Ides of March. Historian Stacy Schiff describes the similarities between the 52-year-old Roman patrician and the 21-year-old Queen of Egypt, detailing that both had daringly crossed lines in their bids for power, both had let the dice fly, both had a great capacity for work as for play, and rarely distinguished between the two. He would have been hard-pressed to find a woman in all of Rome who had raised an army, lent a fleet, controlled a currency. Cleopatra was every bit Caesar's equal as a cool-headed, clear-eyed pragmatist. He was no favorite of the Roman aristocracy. Cleopatra was unloved by the Alexandrian Greeks. Their power derived from the common people. Although he had pressing matters, as well as a wife in Rome, Caesar lingered for a long time in the encaptivating presence of Cleopatra. She took him on a traditional Nile trip. It was here outside of the confines of Alexandria, where she was able to showcase the affection that her people had for their queen. She was, after all, the only member of her family's ruling dynasty to have learned how to read hieroglyphics. Venturing outside the Hellenistic Greek world, the Roman consul would have been left in awe of Egypt's complex systems of locks and dams. The couple would worship at lakeside shrines in front of crocodiles that had been trained to open their jaws on command, and took in the sight of the 68-foot-tall colossi of Memnon. The voyage would have proceeded in luxury, as Cleopatra's so-called barge was equipped with its own gym, stables, library, garden, spiral staircases, as well as a copper bath. Although Julius was clearly infatuated with Cleopatra, his calculating mind would have been overjoyed to see the latent wealth that filled the lands of Upper Egypt. Schiff tells us that everything about the landscape that lay before Caesar and Cleopatra reinforced the myths of Egypt's abundance and the river's magical faculties. Renowned throughout the ancient world, the Nile was said to flow with gold. Extraordinary powers were ascribed to it. Its waters were believed to boil at half the temperature of others. Egyptian women were known for more efficient pregnancies, and men rarely went bald. That last part might seem silly, but the historical record is clear on two facts. First, Julius Caesar was losing his hair at this point. Secondly, he cared very much about the fact that he was balding. The attention of a young goddess distracted the Roman from real issues that had to have been plaguing his thoughts. The New York Times review of books sets the stage, reminding us that many of Pompey's supporters were still under arms. The loss of the leader did not necessarily mean the loss of the cause. Indeed, Pompey's son would not finally be defeated until 35 BCE, almost a decade after Caesar's assassination. What is more, 1,000 miles away from the Nile Delta and Rome itself, Caesar's control was still provisional at best. But he needed a vacation and was hopelessly in love. So rather than take the next steps in consolidating his power, he opted instead for a month-long Nile cruise in the company of his mistress, Cleopatra, who was by then heavily pregnant. Historians are torn whether the happy couple spent 3 or 9 months cruising the countryside. The belief is that it was Cleopatra who eventually turned back, with Caesar willing to continue sailing into Ethiopia in hopes of discovering the origin of the Nile River. Some suggest that it was his soldiers who finally forced him to turn around and get back to the work of ruling Rome. However it came to be, his responsibilities eventually became too pressing to put off any further, and Caesar was obligated to rush off to Armenia, which had entered into a state of revolt. It was during this time that Cleopatra gave birth to their son, naming him Ptolemy Caesar. The boy went by the nickname Caesaron, which translated to Little Caesar. His lengthy absence set off alarm bells in the capital, with Cicero voicing them loudly enough to be heard today. Historian Adrian Goldsworthy notes that in June 47 BCE, Cicero wrote that nothing had been heard from Caesar for 6 months. It was uncharacteristic behavior and adds to the impression that fatigue had taken its toll on him. There is no doubt that his lengthy stay in Egypt caused Caesar great problems, giving his enemies time to regroup and creating a dangerous mood of uncertainty in Rome and Italy. Caesar's supporters had little to unite them apart from their loyalty to him, which was often reliant mainly on gratitude for past actions and lively expectation of more in the future. The Roman consul finally returned to the Italian shores in October, but only stayed long enough to appoint leaders to rule in his place. Interestingly, he overlooked Mark Antony, who had been his greatest champion during Caesar's stay in Egypt. Although no one believes that Antony performed his duties well, Goldsworthy chalks his exclusion due to the need to reward others rather than to denigrate his right-hand man. By the end of December, Caesar's legions were sailing again for North Africa, this time to put an end to the remaining Pompeians assembled there. Through great feats of his leadership, the Romans were victorious despite great odds in the rebels' favor. Although the two lovebirds had spent months traveling within Cleopatra's country, there were clear indications that the two weren't equal partners. She owed her throne directly to Julius's intervention, something that would be hard to forget considering that he had left behind 12,000 Roman legionnaires to ensure her continued protection in his absence. He had also taken her last living sister as a hostage. Rather than a threat, this action may have been for Cleopatra's own sake, as her two other sisters had both attempted to steal the throne of Egypt themselves. Julius also would have awkwardly overseen the queen's marriage to her 10-year-old brother. Such an act was a measure of realpolitik, as tradition had maintained the Ptolemaic line for centuries. Keeping her own situation in the forefront of her mind, there is little to suggest that Cleopatra cared that her lover had a wife waiting for him in Rome. She gave birth to her first child 2 weeks after saying her goodbyes to Julius. Schiff informs us that nothing could better have suited 22-year-old Cleopatra's political agenda than motherhood. With Caesarion on her lap, Cleopatra had no difficulty ruling as a female king. Even before he began to babble, Caesarion accomplished a masterly feat, rendering his feckless uncle wholly irrelevant. Whether Ptolemy XIV realized it or not, his older sister had gained control both of the imagery and the government. Fertility is incredibly important to the Egyptian people, and the fact that Caesarion was born at the precise moment of the early summer rise of the Nile was as sure of a sign of divinity as the Egyptian people could have asked for. Indeed, the nation would experience a run of good harvests in the aftermath of Cleopatra's seizure of power. It also allowed Cleopatra the chance to merge her identity with that of the goddess Isis, a woman that plucked order from chaos, a woman who was both tender and comforting, but able to take up arms and serve as the mistress of war. Despite only existing within the Egyptian pantheon of gods, the cult of Isis had managed to infiltrate Rome through Alexandrian traders. Before he had met Cleopatra, Julius Caesar had barred troublesome Isis priests from entering the city. When he attempted to dismantle their existing temples within Rome, no workman would pick up an axe to deliver the first blow. For what it is worth, Cleopatra never attempted to hide her son. Julius Caesar was by her side for the vast majority of the pregnancy, and upon the boy's birth, his mother had new coins struck with his likeness upon it. Although again, this showed an understanding of realpolitik that Cleopatra was known for, as the image depicted the boy as a young Horus, the son of the goddess Isis. She didn't just sit around coddling her son, however, with Schiff telling us that Cleopatra's responsibilities very nearly rivaled those of the goddess. She not only dispensed justice, commanded the army and navy, regulated the economy, negotiated with foreign powers, and presided over temples, but determined the prices of raw materials and supervised the sowing schedules, the distribution of seed, the condition of Egypt's canals, the food supply. She was magistrate, high priest, queen, and goddess. She was also, on a day-to-day basis and far more frequently, chief executive officer. She headed both the secular and the religious bureaucracies. She was Egypt's merchant-in-chief. The crush of state business consumed most of her day. This stood in stark contrast to the Rome that Caesar ruled, as only Egypt had a highly centralized developed bureaucracy at this moment in history. Indeed, there was perhaps no closer controlled economy in history to Egypt than the Soviet Union. Without government permission, no one in Egypt could fell a tree, breed pigs, or shift their fields from barley to olives. The bureaucracy oversaw every minor decision in the lives of the Egyptian citizens, including when to plant your crops. In many instances, the over-regulation of the economy served to protect government monopolies. In other instances, it ensured that taxes were collected accurately. Tax collection is essential for running and justifying a large class of bureaucrats. Olive oil sold to the crown was taxed at 50%, while professional fishermen surrendered 25% of their catch to the government. Citizens were levied taxes for salt, maintenance of dikes, and pastures. Rather than running off of the merits of others, Cleopatra had inherited an economy that had been in tatters. She worked hard to rebuild the bureaucracy, including redefining the role of a good official, ensuring that he was vigilant, upright, and a beacon of goodwill. It is here that we see clear evidence that Cleopatra wasn't just sitting on her laurels after attaching her wagon to the ruler of Rome. The Smithsonian magazine explains that Cleopatra's foreign policy goal, in addition to preserving her personal power, was to maintain Egypt's independence from the rapidly expanding Roman Empire. By trading with Eastern nations, Arabia, and possibly as far away as India, she built up Egypt's economy, bolstering her country's status as a world power. Impressively, she accomplished all of this within a year of giving birth to her son and heir. In 46 BCE, she traveled to Rome to reconnect with Caesar. Schiff informs us that she took with her secretaries, copyists, messengers, bodyguards, and her brother/husband as well. A wise Ptolemy did not leave a blood relative behind. Whether she traveled for reasons of state or affairs of the heart, or to introduce Caesar to the infant son he had not yet met, is unclear. She may have been waiting for word from Caesar, who would have been away from Rome for nearly 3 years. His return from North Africa, where he brilliantly defeated Pompey's remaining supporters, coincides neatly with Cleopatra's arrival. Two things are abundantly clear. She could not have left Egypt were she not firmly in control of the country, and she would not have dared to set foot in Rome had Julius Caesar not wanted her there. It was a trip that would take a month of sailing against the prevailing wind. After disembarking and gifting Rome its first ever giraffe, the Queen of Egypt settled into one of Caesar's villas. Despite how much time our history classes devote to Rome, it would have seemed as though it were a provincial backwater town to someone used to Alexandria's glory. Schiff notes that it was still the kind of place where a stray dog might deposit a human hand under the breakfast table, where an ox could burst into the dining room. Caesar had already begun to initiate a number of reforms based upon his time spent in Egypt. This included twerks to the Roman calendar, which consisted of just 355 days. Perpetually behind the Earth's rotation around the sun, the priests would randomly add a month in order to catch back up. leading Plutarch to note that only the priests could say the time, and they, at their pleasure without giving any notice, slipped in the new month. In contrast, Caesar referred to the Egyptian calendar as the only intelligent calendar which ever existed in human history. Likewise, he adopted Egypt's 12-hour division between night and day. The delayed effects of implementing such changes meant that 46 BCE, the year of Cleopatra's arrival to Rome, which became known as the Year of Confusion, managed to last an incredible 445 days. The queen kept a low profile, in part not to upset Caesar's wife Calpurnia. But there are clear indicators that the lovers regularly spent long periods of time in private with each other. For instance, Caesar devoted 11 days in September to citywide parties in triumph of his African campaigns. The capital would have come to a standstill during the festivities, which included banquets for groups as large as 60,000 people. Everyone celebrated the man who had become the sole power within Rome, as he used the state to gift the equivalent of 3 months' wages upon his citizens. Historian Monroe Deutsch believes that the 11 days of partying cost the state the equivalent of $70 million in today's wealth. It is impossible to believe that the Queen of Egypt wouldn't have partook in the celebration of the father of her only child. Egypt was prominent in the celebratory displays, which included Cleopatra's teenage sister Arsinoe being paraded at the front of a substantial group of Egyptian prisoners. We don't know Cleopatra's thoughts, but considering that she had attempted to rally her brother's forces in an attempt to murder her, she likely didn't disapprove of the treatment at the hands of her lover. Caesar commissioned a gold, life-size statue of Cleopatra, which resided beside Venus in his favorite temple. In addition to being the deity most associated with the Julie family, Venus, like Isis, was a god that reflected fertility. That ceremony was likely the only experience that made any sense to the Queen of Egypt. In Alexandria, she had been taught to be visible and to take bold action. Romans, however, expected their women to be demure, serving passively in the background as an object to be seen rather than heard. We unfortunately don't know her own thoughts on the subject. But for someone so learned, capable, and experienced, it must have been quite frustrating to find out that women were completely invisible in the intellectual life of Rome. We do know the thoughts of others, however. Schiff informs us that as a marriage crasher who had somehow hustled herself into Venus's exalted company, Cleopatra unsettled Rome on any number of counts. She was female and foreign, an Eastern monarch in what still believed itself to be a king-crushing republic, a stand-in for Isis, whose cult was suspect and subversive and whose temples were notorious spots for hookups. The writings of the time largely reflect the opinion that she was far too extravagant, which shouldn't be that much of a surprise considering that she was independently wealthier than every single man of Rome. Such wealth was on constant display with her favorite lavish pearl earrings, which led Pliny to claim that Cleopatra dangled the equivalent of a Mediterranean villa from each ear. She wouldn't have thought twice about flaunting such wealth. After all, she would later disintegrate one of those pearls in vinegar in order to win a bet with Mark Antony. We aren't sure if she temporarily returned home to Egypt or stayed for a full 18 months, but her Roman adventures appeared to begin anew during the fall of 45 BCE. One account claims that it was during this time that Julius acknowledged Caesaron as his own son, granting her permission to bequeath his name to the child. It made political sense to somewhat legitimize the relationship, as Schiff notes that at least in 45, Caesar's plans could only be furthered by an Eastern heir and living link to Alexander the Great. He was also conceding the obvious. If he had not already begun to do so, 2-year-old Caesarion soon enough resembled his father in looks and manner. By 44 BCE, Caesar, the ruler of the Roman Republic, was drifting aimlessly towards the establishment of a monarchy. Having a son via a recognized queen would have only fueled those rumors. By February, Caesar was named dictator for life. The Senate had seemingly given up their unproductive fight against his never-ending demands. Feeling safe in his control over Rome, he began preparations for a 3-year-long conquest. The 56-year-old Roman intended to conquer his way to India, endeavoring to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. Hoping to restore the Republic in a grand flourish, Brutus and his 60 conspirators decided to remove their colleague who had become their dictator before Caesar was beyond their reach. Goldsworthy informs us that the motives of the conspirators were many and varied, but underlying everything was a sense that to have one man possessing as much permanent power as Caesar was incompatible with a free republic. Under Caesar, many decisions were made behind closed doors by the dictator and his close advisors. And even though they were often good decisions, this wasn't the way the republic was supposed to work. The conspirators worked their plot carefully in order to make it clear to the chroniclers that they were the good guys. The historian continues, writing that the conspirators spoke of liberty and believed that this could only be restored by removing Caesar. Most, perhaps all, felt that they were acting for the good of the entire republic. With Caesar dead, the normal institutions of the state ought to function properly again, and Rome could be guided by the Senate and freely elected magistrates. To show that this was their sole aim, they decided that they would kill the dictator, but no one else, including his fellow consul and close associate Mark Antony. While the restoration of the Republic was the main justification underpinning the assassination of Caesar, Cleopatra's role in this story served as a worthy secondary cause for a number of the conspirators. Rumors had begun within the city that Julius planned to shift Rome's capital to Cleopatra's Alexandria. Furthermore, rumors were flying that he intended to pass a law that would allow him to marry as many women as he liked, with the view of producing a son and heir. Previously, Roman law only recognized marriages between full-blooded Romans. The rumor terrified those that had been able to comfort themselves with the notion that Julius lacked a legitimate child, believing that the political crisis would end soon. Hearing rumors of the new law, it is easy to assume that he planned to marry Cleopatra in order to legitimize their child Caesaron. Such an act would extend his dictatorship beyond his own life through birth lineage. The Roman ruler was aware of some of the grumblings, even refusing his allies' request to reform his elite bodyguard. Goldsworthy suggests that Caesar may have been tired. He probably did not fear death, but that's not to say that he courted it. If his new regime was to succeed, then it couldn't permanently be maintained by fear, but needed to rest on the acceptance that it was better than the alternatives. Showing that he was unafraid of his own class, both his allies and former enemies demonstrated his own confidence. During an emergency session of the Senate, during the period known as the Ides of March, one man tugged Julius's toga. The website History Hit informs us that there was Cimber grabbing on to the revered Caesar, a man who had recently been declared sacrosanct, untouchable. It was a shocking, blasphemous move, but Cimber had his reason. He was one of the conspirators. His grabbing of Caesar's toga, either to hold Caesar down in his chair or to expose the dictator's neck, was the agreed-upon signal for the assassination to begin. The first assassin stepped forward, Publius Casca. Like Cimber, Casca was another former supporter of Caesar, who had since become disillusioned with the statesman. Casca had positioned himself directly behind Caesar and his gilded chair, centimeters from the seated tyrant. Now, with Cimber holding Caesar down, Casca took out his dagger from the folds of his toga, raised his weapon, and aimed for Caesar's neck. He missed. Rather than stab Caesar in the neck, Casca drove his dagger into Caesar's shoulder. Casca cried out to his brother, another senator also in on the plot, to help, but Caesar would not sit idly by. Immediately he leapt up and reacted to Casca's blow. By this point, the meeting room had descended into pandemonium. Marcus Brutus was among the wounded, having been accidentally struck on the hand by Cassius as the latter tried to land a blow on Caesar. Those senators not involved in the plot watched on in panic and soon started to flee. Only 2 senators attempted to aid Caesar, but their efforts proved fruitless. Soon, they too were forced to flee. Dagger after dagger punctured Caesar's body. His toga was smeared with his own very mortal blood. According to Nicolaus, the dying dictator ultimately fell to the ground before the statue of his old rival Pompey. Having received more than 20 stab wounds, there Caesar breathed his last. To say that Rome was shocked in the aftermath is an understatement. The 60 conspirators only comprised 7% of the Roman Senate. Still, such a large portion of the chamber's participation left the government paralyzed to act in the face of what had been a brutal murder within its own sacred halls. Although he had been loathed by the Senate, Caesar retained great popularity with the people. Indeed, the city would rise up to lynch a number of the conspirators during their fallen leader's funeral. Often forgotten in the chaos that ultimately results in the rise of Octavian Augustus is Cleopatra, for she was a guest living in one of Caesar's villas at the time of his demise. Schiff writes that with the possible exception of his wife Calpurnia, to whom the mutilated corpse was delivered, it is unlikely that the news affected anyone as profoundly as Cleopatra. No matter how it registered on a personal level, Caesar's death represented a catastrophic political blow. She had lost her champion. Her situation was now insecure at best. As a student of history, Cleopatra would have known that men tend to solve their differences by finding a woman to blame. Indeed, Homer's Iliad, her favorite piece of literature, laid the entirety of the Trojan War at the feet of Helen of Troy, a woman who had conducted an affair with the ruler of another kingdom. Schiff tells us that the 2 Caesars, before Egypt and after, were incompatible, and incomprehensibly so. Cleopatra supplied a neat dividing line. She could be said to explain his obsession with power and titles in the last 5 months of his life, the royal trappings and divine carvings, the wayward crowns and the oddly autocratic demeanor. By our century, she had come to have conspired in the charades. She planned the absolutist idea in Caesar's mind and was poised to become Empress of Rome. She exercised a decisive, corrupting influence on the Roman leader, to the extent that a new Caesar was born in Egypt, and to the extent that Cleopatra properly qualified as the founder of the Roman Empire. Of course, there's no truth to any of this, but vengeful mobs rarely let the truth get in the way of a good story, particularly those that involve compelling vixens as their villains. Her son's own tutor, Nicolau of Damascus, was the first to implicate Cleopatra, but the best job of laying the blame at her feet was the Roman historian Lucan, whom a century after the murder claimed that she had aroused Caesar's greed. After a half-hearted attempt at confronting the boldest of the accusations, Cleopatra and her court followers fled back to Alexandria. Her retreat can likely be construed as a mother's instincts, for in March of 44 BCE, Cleopatra was pregnant once again. Schiff explains the implications for us, writing that, unlike Caesarion, the second child had been conceived on Roman soil. All of Rome knew it to be Caesar's. What if Cleopatra bore a boy and chose to press her case? Unfortunately, we'll never know the answer, as Cleopatra suffered a miscarriage on the stressful trip back home. Caesar hadn't expected to die, but his death had been on his mind. After all, he was 55 years old and had spent the vast majority of those years living the harsh life of a soldier. After his death, his last living testament and will were unsealed and accepted by the Roman Senate. It made no mention of his child with Cleopatra. Goldsworthy writes that on balance, a better case can be made for assuming that Caesar was the father of Caesarion, but he was illegitimate, not a Roman citizen, and only an infant. The boy was not even mentioned in a will drawn up by the dictator in the last months of his life. The most prominent position was given to the grandson of his sister, the 18-year-old Caius Octavius, to whom he had taken some interest in recent years. It seems likely that Caesar discerned some of the great talent in the youth who would become Emperor Augustus. It's been a while, but I want to end this episode returning back to the opener, which talked about Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. Those actors had made choices that had for a decade placed them atop the hierarchy of Hollywood royalty. From the outside looking in, it was a choice that had seemed to have paid off for everyone in their household, giving them the family that both claimed to have desired above all else. Yet a messy divorce has now hinted that all was not well. While the love of their children likely means that neither Pitt nor Jolie would ever publicly say that they regret the decisions they made, we are left to wonder if their choices had been the right ones, or if they had chosen poorly. Unfortunately, we rarely get to know whether the choices that we make are the right ones, for you can't live another life than the one that you are blessed with. Whether it was blinded by love or not, Cleopatra had made a conscious choice to tie herself to Julius Caesar. If the rumors were true, she had faithfully steered the Roman dictator to the precipice of naming her city the capital of Rome, and their son the ruler of the largest and most powerful empire in the world. Even if those rumors weren't true, however, she had positioned herself next to the only man in the world who was capable of guaranteeing her safety. Schiff writes that she had played the game cannily and correctly, more effectively than any Ptolemy before her, only to find herself back at square one, blindsided by events, sabotaged by a wholesale revision of the rules. As a near contemporary marveled, who can adequately express their astonishment at the changes of fortune and the mysterious vicissitudes of human affairs? Cleopatra was only 26 years old, on the run, and fearful for the life of Julius Caesar's only son. Join us for our next episode as she picks up the pieces in a desperate attempt to rebuild her position. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.